Hi, good morning, and welcome back to the Nearshore Estuary Knowledge Exchange Workshop. I hope you all had a reasonable break, and we'll move forward with our next speaker now. And our next speaker is Dr. Jason Toft, who's a research scientist at the University of Washington in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. Jason's work focuses on the ecological interactions of juvenile fish and invertebrates within estuaries and nearshore habitats. Jason has special interest in nearshore restoration and the effects of shoreline armoring on Puget Sound. He's been monitoring shoreline armor restoration in Puget Sound for over a decade and spearheaded leads the Shoreline Monitoring Database, which is a project that established standardized protocols for shoreline monitoring and provides tools for data management and analysis. I'll pass it over to Jason now.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Byron, for that introduction. And I was enjoying that calming music and good photo collage during break. I am speaking to you from down here south of the border in Seattle, Washington. And where I'm at the University of Washington. Our lab's name is the Wetland Ecosystem Team. And I'd like to recognize that UW campus sits on land of the Coast Salish peoples, and that's the shared waters of Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. What else can I say about my title slide? I want to talk to you today about shoreline restoration effectiveness in the Salish Sea. Most of my talk today will focus on sites in our Puget Sound waters, going north up to the San Juan Islands, just south of the border. So I'll give you the U.S. perspective, and it was really great having those talks this morning from Julian and Isabel. It really set the stage, and lots of common ground, of course, across the Salish Sea. So the photo I'm showing you here is from some of our work looking at a restored site. This site in particular is up in Deception Pass, and a number of us working on a beach together. So I'll talk a lot today about community scientists and broadening our monitoring effort in order to inform how effective a lot of our restored sites are working. Okay, let's go to our next slide. So I want to do a little bit of a definition first and talk about living shorelines. And this graphic is showing the intermix of what we refer to as living shorelines in the context of restoration and engineering. And so oftentimes the goal is to restore habitat, but in many cases we have to recognize that we're not restoring back to pure natural conditions. Oftentimes you need to incorporate some elements of design that might be artificial, which leans toward engineering. And so living shorelines kind of bridges the gap between restoration and engineering. I'll be talking today a lot about living shorelines, and I'll start off my talk talking about that and then move on to more what we refer to as eco-engineering to give you some perspectives of what can be done in a very urban setting along our shorelines. Okay, and other definitions apply to living shorelines. I think it was Isabel referred to nature-based solutions. And so lots of overlap in terminology, but most recognizing that the goal is restoration, and we're doing some combination of natural and artificial design components. So let's talk about armor impacts. And Megan Detier at Friday Harbor Labs at UW led a bunch of us a number of years back to look at the impacts of armor. And this was really important to set the groundwork so that when armor is constructed or when we're talking about impacts, we know what they are. And I'm showing you a photo here of a site at Seahurst Park, south of Seattle. This is a public park, and this photo is showing you from the 1970s what this site looked like during construction, during the installation of armor. As you can see, it looks like it dramatically affects the upper intertidal zone where this armor is placed. And again, this is what it looks like during construction. Once construction is over, then that armor is placed. And when we went out to measure the impacts of this armor, we found that a lot of the impacts were negative in that upper intertidal zone. If you're talking about driftwood coming in, beach rack being deposited on an ebbing tide, and the invertebrates that live there, there was a large impact directly in that upper intertidal zone. So important to measure the impacts of armor. And then when we move into talking about restoration and how effective it is, it's also important. So I put restoration effectiveness here as a question because it is a question. As a scientist and scientists in our group, we're collecting data to inform this. And so you're not trying to prove the restoration worked, you're collecting data to inform how effective it either was or wasn't. And this photo is showing that same stretch of shoreline when armor was being removed in 2014. And I put it in black and white just so you could see, lo and behold, it's a construction site. And again, if I scroll back, very similar, a construction site where you're placing in armor and then a construction site where you're removing armor. So you can't assume that restored sites are effective because there's a large impact during that removal process. So we set out to measure this, and I'll show you some photos here of a neighboring stretch of shoreline, again at this public park called Sierras Park, and combining impacts of armor and restoration effectiveness. So the photo on the left is the armor that was constructed there and was up there for 50 years or so. The stretch that was removed here was removed in 2005. So that middle photo is right after construction was done. And you can see that armor was removed, some logs were placed, some vegetation planted. There was sediment brought into the site. We refer to that as sediment nourishment. And then the photo on the right is in 2019. And you can see that visually, this restored site looks like it's working given that time frame. It looks like a natural site. If you walk down there today, you wouldn't ever think really that armor had been placed there at some point. Okay, so that's what I'll be gearing up towards informing you about. And Julian did a great cover of salmon use of estuaries this morning. And when we move more into the near shore, this is just a schematic of what we know of juvenile salmon and their needs. So it's a cross section of a beach. We know that salmon need abundant prey along the shoreline so they can feed. They in turn don't want to be eaten by other bigger things. And again, they're getting used to saltwater. It takes a while for them to transition from freshwater to saltwater. And this is an out-migration corridor. And you can see in this kind of middle area in the intertidal zone where the tide goes in and out, this is very key to nearshore processes where they're looking for food. Especially Chinook and chum, we find, are really craving that really shallow water close to shore. So again, this is the natural processes that we're trying to restore to. Okay, and again, I'm a scientist. I like to speak about data, and it's important to realize the role of science in restoration. And it's a feedback loop. So prior to restoration is the chance to inform your goals. What are you trying to accomplish? During project design is your chance to incorporate that data, find out what's been learned and see if that can improve your project design. And again, as Julian mentioned earlier this morning, monitoring restoration is so important, what works and what doesn't, and having this be a feedback loop. Okay, so before I go into some case studies, I want to highlight this website on the Shoreline Monitoring Database. And you can find it online at shoremonitoring.org. We have had lots of community scientist engagement in these projects, so volunteers in the community, and it's been built up on protocol accessibility, a way to upload and download data in a common format, and also some data visualizations. And this has really grown over the last 10 years. It's been a really fun, it's one of those fun inspirational projects where over 10 years ago, we were approached by some community scientist groups, and they really just were craving more techniques, more information. They didn't have the protocols they needed, the training they needed, and they're asking the scientific community for help. So as part of the expertise in a group of us under the acronym PSUMP, the PSUMP Nearshore Work Group, we initially got some protocols together that we agreed were good at monitoring our beaches, provided them, and then over the last, say, 5 years, built up this database website where it's interactive and anyone can upload and download data. That's been hugely useful in broadening what we can accomplish and really good at outreach as well and engaging community members. So I'll just highlight a few of our protocols here. I won't go into a lot of them. There's 20 up on the website. 11 currently have data features of upload and download and visualizations. And a lot of the ones I'll talk about today are listed here, and I'll describe them briefly. Beach wrack is on an ebbing tide, all that algae, eelgrass, leaf litter that settles on the upper shore. Logs or driftwood that come into a site and can help stabilize features. Riparian vegetation along the shoreline. We focus a lot on insects. They're really good as prey for juvenile Chinook salmon in nearshore areas. And also looking at sediment size. Our Salish Sea beaches are mixed sediment, and so important to know for a variety of reasons what is there in geomorphology. You can notice I did not put fish up here. There is a protocol for fish. But oftentimes we found that if you're measuring the effectiveness of a site and you know what characteristics the juvenile salmon are relying upon, you can monitor those habitat metrics, and it's really good at detailing the functioning of that site. Okay, so check out that website sometime, and let's move and do a few case studies. So I'll walk through a few case studies here, and again, built off the community of practitioners that are out there monitoring these beaches, ourselves and collaborators. The first one I want to describe to you is looking at 3 different shore types, and the photos show them here. We looked at restored sites where there was armor removal. We looked at armored sites where there was a control, and also reference sites, so those natural conditions that are what we're trying to restore to. At each of these 10 locations detailed here on this map, we had 3 of those shore types, so 30 beaches in total. This was one of our first efforts at really trying to get a larger signature spatially on how these restored sites were working. Okay, I'm going to show you no graphs from this project, but I'm going to show you a color scheme summarizing of the statistical tests. And the colors here are detailing kind of less to more. So light blue is less of a metric, and darker blue is more of a metric. You can see here that if you look at the armored column, all in light blue. So we found lower measurements overall of these metrics. Restored sites were kind of in the middle of armored and reference. In some cases, for example, beach wrack, we found that that came into a site pretty quickly once the armor was removed. Others, like logs and riparian vegetation, were not quite at reference conditions yet, and it kind of makes sense. It takes time for driftwood to wash in. It takes time for plants to grow. And in our invertebrate community, we found restored sites really in between. And so rack invertebrates are mostly crustaceans, these beach hopper amphipods that are living in the beach rack, and then insects along shoreline vegetation. Okay, so some things restore quick, some things might take more time. And important to note in this study that the average age these sites were restored was only 4 years. So again, this is pretty young in the age of restored sites, and something we hope to keep monitoring through time. Okay, so I'll move to our next case study. This is looking at a similar suite of sites, and this paper referenced on the bottom is by our recent postdoc, Simone DeRoche, who grew up in Vancouver, so it's good to have some BC connections. And this study that she led was looking at variability. And I'm going to walk you through this and show you that it's not just kind of like the abundance of certain things overall, but also the variability within that. And if you look at the top 3 boxes, this is illustrating 3 different natural sites, and showing in this case beach rack that there can be variability in what we see, overall leading to a higher measurement, but also more messiness in there. Whereas if you look at an armored beach, we see uniformly low measurements. And again, when we restore that, then we're trying to restore not only abundance of something, but also variability. And it's fun to talk about that messiness of natural beaches, because they are messy. You walk along a natural beach, and there's just a lot of diversity and heterogeneity along that beach. Okay, so you can check out that publication for more information on that. The third one I want to talk about here is looking at different living shoreline components. And I'll take a moment here to walk through this. we gathered enough spatial size in our restored sites, up close to 30, that we're able to separate them into ones where all that happened was armor removal. So pre-restoration, we had shoreline armor. It moved on to armor removal. And then at some sites, there was armor removal, but also these other elements of vegetation planting, log placement, and sediment nourishment. And so we were curious how these interacted. What happened if you only had armor removal versus if you had some combination of planting of vegetation, placement of driftwood, and sediment nourishment. So I'll walk you through one slide here detailing two graphs. And I'm showing you information where we found an interaction. And so if you look at the number of beach logs, and in this case, it's actually looking at the mean line width. Before removal, you see a low value of mean line width, and then it shows increasing length of armor removed. And so shortest to intermediate to longest. And you can see in this case that when you had longer stretches of armor removed, you're seeing more beach logs. And if we move on to look at beach rack, this is looking at when logs were placed on the beach. So when you're doing restoration construction, you're removing the armor and you're bringing in logs to place on the beach. And you can see that in this case, low mean percent cover beach rack before removal. If you don't place those logs, we were seeing less beach rack. But if you do place logs, we're seeing more beach rack. And so those logs can help stabilize that upper beach, trap sediments and trap beach rack, and just provide more habitat features of that site. Okay, so I want to pause here for a moment and talk about our Salish Sea beaches and talk about feeder bluffs. And so much of the shoreline along our beaches are supplied by eroding feeder bluffs, and they're of glacial origin, and they feed sediment to the beaches. That's the name feeder bluff. And really important for maintaining our beaches, especially in the face of climate change and sea level rise. If you place armor at the bottom of that feeder bluff, you are protecting that beach if you have shoreline property, but also holding back nourishing that beach with a continuous amount of sediments. And that can be a problem. And I'll show you a few slides on this. There's a variety of shore types along our beaches, and I'm going to show you a study here where we separated out our restored sites based on 3 different coastal landforms. So the photos on the right, if you look at feeder bluffs in the middle, again, these are eroding bluffs supplying sediment to the beaches. The upper photo is what we call an accretion shore form. This is a low elevation beach where sediments from updrift are maintaining that beach, so it's accreting sediment. And if you look at the lower photo, we refer to that as a pocket beach, also a lower elevation beach. They're buttressed by rocky headlands on either side, so they don't have a sediment drift cell in that location feeding sediments from elsewhere. So with this study, we looked at these 3 different shore types, and we also looked at fetch. So fetch is the distance that waves are building up due to wind. Some sites are really protected and have low fetch, and thus less coastal forces coming in, whereas some have really high fetch and larger waves acting on those beaches. So again, we had enough study sites to try to divvy this up and look at these 2 features when we analyze the data. So I'll walk you through 2 graphs here. First, looking at shore type at natural and restored sites. And if we look at count of fallen trees, if you look at the green dots and lines here, you can see that feeder bluffs had higher number of fallen trees than accretion shore forms and pocket beaches at both natural and restored sites, and again, a bit more at natural sites. So this is showing that not only is sand and other sediments eroding from these bluffs, but also there's fallen trees that are being settling onto that beach and providing more habitat features. And then if we look at fetch, as you can see here, as fetch increases along the horizontal axis, we're seeing less amount of surface sand. And so those heavy waves are washing away these smaller sediments, such as sand. Whereas if you have a more protected site, you can get more sand in that upper beach because it's not being washed away as much. And so this study showed that there definitely is certain effects of different shore types, and also of the amount of fetch working on those beaches. Okay, one more site I want to just mention here on bluff restoration. And this study we just finished, so I'm not going to show you any data. In general, we found that restoring sediment supply at sites that are armored could double their ecological function. And instead of showing you graphs and whatnot at this point in the talk, I want to show you a video, and I'll focus on fish for that. We did a lot of different monitoring techniques during the study. One of them, which was snorkel surveys to count fish and see if they were feeding, focused on juvenile salmon and forage fish. And so we created a highlight reel of some GoPro footage. And I'll show you it. It's going to talk through some of the project design, but mostly I want to show it just so you can see what fish we see along these beaches. Okay, you can find this on YouTube. It's on our department's YouTube site if you want to search for it. And again, this is what the project was titled, and a variety of co-authors there. There's us snorkeling, and that's what it looks like. We're snorkeling really close to shore. There's a feeder bluff. Hopefully this is streaming decently enough for everyone, and if it's not, again, you can find it online. This study looked at these different management prioritizations of protect high and low and restore high and low. And so it's just looking at the potential to supply sediment to the beaches, just showing you a variety of different feeder bluffs in different natural and outward conditions. So we went out and did a lot of observations here. Here's the juvenile Chinook. We see it, we can see them feeding sometimes. Sometimes we see them one at a time. Sometimes we see a school of them. Sometimes they're hard to see. You'll see pointing it out on the bottom there. So definitely visibility is a factor. And here's some forage fish. So sandlands, really important to our nearshore food web. And a variety of other fish, of course. So juvenile salmon and forage fish are often what we focus on, but a whole lot is going in really quite shallow water close to shore. So again, if you're looking at armor impacts or benefits of restoration, there's a lot there. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide here, but check out that sometime if you want to see more about that study. Okay, so this is, I want to highlight so far the key messages because I've covered a lot, and I'm doing this here because I'm about to move into our more urban sites and talk about eco-engineering. So key messages: armor removal is often effective at restoring close to natural levels, and we want to keep monitoring to figure out, given more time, how close to natural levels they get. The length of armor removed can lead to increased response in some cases. I showed you an example of driftwood coming into a site. Placement of logs during restoration is an effective living shoreline treatment, and shore type and fetch can govern restoration response. Okay, I hope those key messages will stick with you. And again, I'm going to move on to some eco-engineering here, and it's centered around the Seattle waterfront. And this cartoon here was from a grad student of ours, just detailing what can be done when you have increasing human use constraints. On the left of the cartoon, you see a pocket beach in places where you can excavate from armor landward in order to create a beach. When you get to really urban, deep seawalls, it changes your options. In this case, you can build what we call a habitat bench. So it's mimicking shallow water at the base of the seawall. You could reduce your pier imprint and add light features. The LPS means light penetrating structures like glass blocks or grating. And again, the seawall itself, you can make it textured, put ledges in it, make it look more like a climbing wall instead of just a straight concrete wall. So I'll detail a few studies along the Seattle waterfront that if some of you have been down here, maybe you visited. So the Olympic Sculpture Park is part of the Seattle Art Museum, and it's just on the north edge of downtown. The photo on the left is what it looked like way back in 2004, so 20 years ago now. There was what we call riprap, that jumbled rock there, and a seawall. And where the riprap was, there was this pocket beach excavated landward. And a habitat bench, which you can't see in the background here, was placed at the base of the seawall. So this was the first application along downtown Seattle where we really got to test this out. And a publication there to find out more information, and just a photo here of some juvenile Chinook salmon at the site. And some of the prey items we know they feed on, insects and small crustaceans. So I'll lead you through a few photos here. So benches. This upper left photo is at the Olympic Sculpture Park. And again, it's not a restoration action per se, it's more of an engineering feature where what was placed at the base of this riprap was an extended bench. And it stuck out about 10, 15 feet. And it's trying to provide that shallow water gradient that we know these small salmon are looking for close to shore. And the lower left photo is showing it from that sidewalk above at a lower tide. And you can see it's crated, but it is there. It's more like a corridor along the shoreline. And pretty cool that a lot of bull kelp and other algae came in and settled in pretty quickly as well. So that was the first test case study. And then the photo on the right is a much larger application along the downtown Seattle seawall. And for those of you that have been down here, from about the Seattle Aquarium south to the ferry terminal. So a long stretch there, and putting this at a more large scale. And I'll show you some more features along the seawall itself where I'm categorizing this as bumps. And so the upper left was different designs of the seawall, placing more complexity into it. And this was based on a study we did with some field work shown in the lower left, where some hardy grad students went out in float tubes and took measurements of these different cobbly and ledge features to see what worked. Where was algae settling more? Where were there more barnacles and diversity of those invertebrates? That again can be good as an increased habitat to produce juvenile salmon prey. So on the right is at a low tide along the downtown waterfront. Again, a large application of this that was, it took a few years and really it's ongoing. Around 2017 or so is when a lot of this happened. And you can see that there's light coming in above from these glass blocks, mostly in some cases grading. And the seawall features itself have this cobbly feature and ledges sticking out. And then again, this bench at a low tide. So it's exposed here at low tide. At a high tide, the water is going to be covering mostly everything there. Okay, so I'm not going to show you any data from this at this point in the talk, but just to detail that overall, we found that juvenile salmon were getting benefit of this. We found them distributed more evenly. Previously, we found juvenile salmon schooling where the piers connect to shore. They did not like that artificial, really dark habitat. They're visual feeders, and we found them schooling at the edges. With getting increased light down there, we find them distributed more. And we're also seeing them feeding underneath that. So again, really important to provide this opportunity for them to feed and grow when they're out migrating along these shorelines. I'm going to end my talk just by showing you two photos of juvenile salmon schools we see along the waterfront, and then a short video. And so juvenile chum salmon we find in large numbers. They're a little smaller when they out migrate. And you can see a school of them here, again, at a higher tide, with the ledges and seawall on the right, and then the habitat bench below it. So we see a lot of chum salmon, and we also see Chinook salmon. And you'll see this a bit better in the video I'm about to show, but you can see here, this is shallow water right along downtown Seattle. You can see a Chinook there darting to the surface to feed probably on insects or something that's settled into that upper water layer. And this site you'll see in the video next, but it's actually at a crated beach by our downtown ferry terminal where the beach wasn't excavated landward, but was built out waterward. So I'll end by showing you just a snippet of this video, and then we can head towards questions. Before I start playing it, you can find this online. It's up on YouTube, and we have highlights from both 2021 and 2022. Again, from GoPros that we have on our clipboards. So we're recording data, and we keep the GoPros going just so we can help us talk later back in the lab on what fish we see and identifications. And we get to put through some highlight reels. And so this one, I think it's about a minute is all I'm showing you of it. It'll walk you through some of the sites so you can see how urban they are. That's the crated beach by the ferry terminal. Some sites in really the heart of downtown by our aquarium and a new public pier that was built called Pier 62. And then zooming north to where the Olympic Sculpture Park was. So really in the heart of downtown. This is underneath that Pier 62. You can see more light getting down there. A school of juvenile chum salmon. Here's those Chinook salmon in shallow water at that beach feeding from the surface. So you can see that juvenile salmon are using this habitat. It's pretty awesome to be in this major urban center. You know, when we're snorkeling along that seawall with the glass blocks above us, we're literally swimming underneath people walking above us. So it's encouraging to see that something can be done in this urban setting. Even if you can't do true restoration, you can improve that habitat. So with that, looks like I'm at zero time, and I'll say thanks to everyone else in our lab, tons of collaborators, of course. So a lot of names acknowledged here and our funding sources. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Jason. That was, again, a wonderful presentation and lots for folks to soak in. I think there were a few, we're monitoring the Slido questions sort of earlier on in the talk, and I think some of them, you might have touched on some of that later on, some of the questions were raised, but still for me, and it ties into a couple of those, is, well, it was interesting to see the engineering solutions for those larger structures that you spoke to near the end. But earlier on in your your presentation, where you're looking at more smaller armoring type work and the monitoring of the effectiveness with respect to the restoration outcomes of removing those. And I'm not sure I took out of it as much around whether there was monitoring of the other outcomes around shoreline protection and other values other than the sort of ecological resources there, and whether you could speak to that a bit, the options in those sort of circumstances. And I think a couple of the questions there lead into that, and in particular the one that speaks about speaking back to the threat of sort of coastal squeeze and the reduction of habitat availability, and looking at, what are the effectiveness of these other options than hard armoring to achieve that win-win circumstance.
Okay, I'll try to interpret what you were saying versus me trying to read at the same time. And I think what you're asking about is perhaps around stability of the beaches. Is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah, sort of stability of those beaches, and when you talk about either we're maybe lessening the amount of hard armoring or removing hard armoring, what are the other sort of elements you build into that restoration that achieve sort of the erosion protection benefits that those structures initially were intended to provide, and whether that was part of the monitoring that you were conducting as well?
Yeah, I can comment on some of that, and because it's important. I'm not advocating that armor can be removed in all cases. Of course, it has to be in a place where it's suitable, and the cases that we have studied are ones where it is suitable, where there are situations where it seems like armor never needed to be placed there in the first place. And now that we've learned more about that, a lot of the cases where we look at more of the stability of the beaches by measuring beach profile or the sediments that is there, we find those beaches still being stable, even in cases like at the Olympic Sculpture Park, where it's a really artificial beach. There hasn't needed to be a lot of maintenance there. Sometimes there can be situations where maybe some of your sediment may wash away. We haven't seen a lot of that, but that's the main maintenance that might occur, or to keep an eye in your monitoring. And I think the other thing that was touched on with logs earlier, those logs can really stabilize the beach. And so there's ways to place natural components that aren't concrete where you can still stabilize the beach. Oftentimes those logs are anchored. And the one thing maybe with maintenance or what to be concerned about that I have seen happen is in cases where creosote logs wash up on the beach. That's the only case I know of around here where people have gone in and removed those, mostly for health reasons. If it's a public park, you don't want our kids playing around those if they wash up on beaches or if they have nasty nails sticking out of them or something like that. So, there's a lot I could comment on with your question. I think the other place I could direct people is to an organization called Shore Friendly. So if you go to shorefriendly.org, that is geared towards providing information to private landowners on the options at their beaches. Because again, in not all cases can you remove that armor, but mostly every landowner is concerned about maintenance. If there's some kind of failing of their shoreline armor, and what can they do if they can't remove it? How might they provide some more natural features there, either with planting of vegetation, placement of logs, and it just helps with the planning process.
Great, thanks. And I think the key takeaway for me from that is the circumstance really helps drive what the solution might be, and it was encouraging for me to see some of the later stuff that showed that even when there's a heavy hard engineering, there are still options to make them more ecologically friendly. And thanks. I'll maybe look to Jason if he's at something you want to speak to from the Slido there or otherwise.
Sure. It looks like we've got lots of traffic in the Slido, and I'll just go to the one at the top of the list from Leah. Nice comment, such cool work. But can you comment on the budgetary considerations that factored into the Seattle eco-engineering examples, and comment on how funding contributed to the design?
Yeah, great question. And something at that scale is not cheap, of course. And the way it happened was because, in a way, it had to happen. Back in the Nisqually earthquake, which happened over 20 years ago now, it was a small earthquake and centered around Seattle. And there was some subsidence of a bit of the seawall there in downtown, which is when the engineers obviously became concerned about failure. And that's when it came up that stretch of seawall had to be replaced. And so during that long process, there was a bond measure, so all taxpayer funded, where we had to vote on the funding package for that. And so that took a while. Once it was funded through this bond measure, then that opened up the design. And it was really cool because this was happening anyway. And it's really important to have a seat at the table, no matter what your specialty is. I never really thought I would be in meetings with engineers and talking about concrete, but it was really great to be there because you don't get everything you might want, but you get something, right? And so part of the process that came out of that is when you're pouring concrete, you're using form liners. You can pour it in a straight line, or you can get a form liner that has a little bit of complexity. So some things were not a large budgetary component, and then some things were. And the reason that came out, though, was because of Chinook salmon being listed south of the border as threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And so in the grand scheme of that large Seattle seawall replacement, it was a drop in the bucket. This was just like millions and millions and millions of dollars. And so having a bit that would go towards construction and design of that bench was really small compared to everything else that had to happen.
Well, thanks for that. I can appreciate the idea of matching the action to the opportunity. I think maybe where Leah was going with the question was partly around, can you help us wrap our heads around, if this wasn't attached to an earthquake remediation capital project, if we just showed up in Seattle or Vancouver or whatever and said, hey, we want to do that in a spot, can you give us a ballpark of how much that would cost per 100 meters or per kilometer or something like that? Or is that putting you too much on the spot for something that is too specific?
It's too specific, sorry. It's like there's so many, there's just so much there, and that's not my specialty. So I think it depends on, obviously, the use of the shoreline, what's there, how long is it. There's just a lot of contributing features, and really what people want to have happen Maybe I can give one more example from the Olympic Sculpture Park. That was designed and brought in by the Seattle Art Museum. And again, it didn't necessarily need to happen, creating that pocket beach and the bench at the base of the seawall, but they recognized that at some point in the future, that seawall was going to fail and they would have to do something about it. So they took that opportunity when they knew they had to do some work down there to take care of it in advance instead of having to be responsible of a failure in the future. And so I think that's very key during these really urban areas, is if you have an opportunity where something has to happen, then by all means, that's your moment right there to do this sort of thing.
All right, well, thanks for that. I'll maybe just turn to Byron. I think we can squeeze one more question in before we transition. So over to you, Byron.
Sure, thanks, Jason. I'll maybe look at the top question there from Andrew McNaughton. Thanks for the question. Sort of highlighting that there's a lot of photos and videos of cobble and gravel as beach substrate, and how important is sand on beaches in terms of the ecological values. And I guess I might add, and what are the, when you're talking about beach stability around some of these different designs, what are the opportunities around sand, I guess, or is that one of the outcomes that you might achieve, or are you always going to end up with sort of cobble and gravel due to ongoing wave action and such?
Yeah, I really think it's a mix of everything. I have a hard time prioritizing sand, gravel, cobble, because Salish Sea beaches are mixed sediment. And oftentimes you see all three of those at a beach, and it can vary with elevation. High up on the beach, you might get more sand, and lower, you might get more cobble. Due to natural forces, and that can even change seasonally. When it's this time of year and you have large winter storms, a lot of sediment moves around. So maybe you notice more gravel and cobble in what I did show, because those were settings where the designers knew it had to be more stable due to it either being right in downtown Seattle with lots of waves, or in a more exposed site. And so certainly in more protected sites, you can get sand at a beach, and we know that's really important. We know those smaller sediment sizes are very important for a variety of reasons. One that I didn't talk about today is for forage fish spawning. Surf smelt and sand lynx are two common beach spawners, and both of those have like certain sediment types they key in on. But certainly sand and gravel are very important for both of those. And I think it just you have to be particular to the setting you're applying it. If you place sand in a high energy environment, likely it's going to wash away. So just being informed on what you can accomplish at a given site.
Great, thanks very much. And I do note that there's still quite a bit of traffic there coming in on Slido, but I think for the sake of time, I'll pass back to Jason to introduce our next speaker.